It's been 2 years since I made my original video on the worst balance changes in Clash Royale, and since then, I didn't think there would be as many bad balance changes as there has been from 2023 to 2025, so I put together another list of terrible balance changes to find out what truly is the worst balance change in Clash Royale history. The Goblin Curse was a super special card that brought so many new mechanics to Clash Royale, not only being able to spawn goblins, but also giving damage amplification to your troops. The Goblin Curse began to get really popular in July and August 2025 because it worked well with P.E.K.K.A. and Goblin Giant, since you could clear out swarms and also punish your opponent with the spawned goblins, and Rage worked well with both P.E.K.K.A. and Goblin Giant. But in September 2025, Clash Royale removed its damage amplification, but increased its base damage, and at face value this seemed like a really good change, since the dev team had stated that the Goblin Curse was designed to be a spell that could spawn goblins, and that damage amplification wasn't their main goal with this card.
But we've been looking at other spells that are only about the damage amplification instead of like mixing a bunch of mechanics together.
But if this was the case, then why was Clash Royale so hesitant to properly nerf this card? I mean, if they didn't really intend for damage amplification to be something important to the card, then they should have nerfed it way earlier on in the card's lifetime. The issue with removing the damage amplification more than a year after release is that the damage amplification became a viable mechanic to use the card for, whereas the goblin spawning just became a gimmick. So by leaving the Goblin Curse in that broken state where it had damage amplification, it meant that players had adapted to it as if it was something that Clash Royale couldn't just remove from the card. This nerf gave the same energy as Clash Royale, increasing the witch's damage, but removing her skeleton spawning ability suddenly. It makes no sense to leave a mechanic for so long on a card just to remove it. So before I get comments about this, no, I am not saying that removing the damage amplification itself was a bad nerf. I actually think that it was a nerf that the card needed, since it made no sense for a card that spawned goblins to have damage amplification, and it also allows Clash Royale to put the damage amplification ability on a different card where it would make more sense, like for example the Rage evolution. I just think the fact that they took over a year to remove the damage amplification was the bad part of this nerf. I think this issue could have been avoided if Clash Royale removed the damage amplification while the card was dead back in late 2024, so that when it became popular again, it wouldn't be a feature that everyone knew the card for. The Goblin Curse went from having around a 10% usage rate before the nerf to basically a 0% usage rate in competitive play. So Clash Royale's hesitance basically killed an actually interesting card. June 2024 was a crazy time for Clash Royale, as I talked about in my video of the worst metas, since it had the overpowered Goblin Machine, Goblin Curse, and Goblin Demolisher. However, something that not a lot of people may realize is that it was also during this time that Clash Royale buffed the Prince and the Ram Rider, but they executed it so badly that it is honestly a top 10 worst balance change of all time in my opinion. Both the Prince and the Ram Rider had their charge distance reduced from 3 tiles down to just 1.5 tiles. At a 3 tile charge distance, these cards were pretty bad. Since they took so long to charge, it just wasn't worth it to use them, since you could easily counter them with a log and still have like 1 or 2 seconds to place something else and avoid the charge. If the selling point for these cards was that they can charge, dealing extra damage, you would have expected your Prince or Ram Rider to at least dash more than once. Otherwise, you could have just used a mini P.E.K.K.A. in place of a Prince or a Hog Rider in place of a Ram Rider, and saved the elixir as well as have more consistent interactions. But 1.5 tiles was way too short. Even if you logged the Prince or Ram Rider last second, they could still end up charging on your tower.
I think we actually just lost. Dude, Goblin Curse, bro. Goblin Curse, man.
1.5 tiles was so outrageous for these cards, since they could basically always charge, and if you weren't careful you could take thousands of damage for literally no reason. And since these cards dealt so much damage and moved so fast while charging, it was genuinely impossible to get a positive elixir trade on them. You know it's bad when a Prince is able to charge onto an Electro Wizard, since his charge up time was faster than the attack time interval for the Electro Wizard. Both the Prince and the Ram Rider shot up to a 30% usage rate in competitive play just a week after this change, and Clash Royale later changed this charge distance to 2 tiles, which was still outrageous for these cards. To this day, it confuses me how these versions of the Prince and the Ram Rider made it past playtesting, and Clash Royale should have just started at 2 tiles and worked backwards instead of starting at 1.5 tiles. Something that I feel like a lot of people don't realize is that just because a card's usage rate is high does not mean that it's a broken card. It just means that the card is quite versatile, but it's not always the case. The log is a perfect example of a card that is pretty popular despite not being too OP. But in July of 2025, Clash Royale decided to nerf the log by reducing its damage by 8%. And I feel like this nerf just didn't make sense. 8% is not enough to have a major change on normal interactions at equal levels such as killing bait cards, but it meant that underleveled logs could no longer kill +1 bait cards like princesses and dark goblins, which is so crazy since the level problem is already bad enough in Clash Royale. This nerf made literally no sense for the vast majority of the player base since they could no longer reliably use the log, since it was useless if there was even a slight level variation between you and your opponent, which defeated the purpose of the balance change since it meant to reduce the usefulness of the log in competitive play, but ended up destroying its chance to do well in casual play with barely any impact on competitive play. This nerf just felt so backwards for game balance, since the log was one of the most popular spells in the game, so giving these players such a disadvantage for no reason makes no sense, especially since it literally made the log pay to win. This has to be one of the worst balance changes of all time, and I still don't understand the point for a nerf like this. I've already mentioned multiple times on my channel that the mirror is a terribly balanced card, and that Clash Royale should just bite the bullet and not try to make this card viable, since there's nothing you can do to make the mirror a balanced card. But despite this realization, Clash Royale is still adamant on trying to make the mirror work. And in April 2022, Clash Royale went way too far with this card by buffing it so that it would now mirror +2 leveled cards, instead of just +1 leveled cards. Now, I'm not saying that this made the mirror the best card in the game, but I just don't see how this change was at all beneficial, not only for the mirror but for the game overall. Having +2 leveled cards is so game breaking, since it makes the level difference problem that this game has even worse, but also, it doesn't really help the mirror that much unless you are specifically playing some cards that did well with the mirror at the time, like the Electro Giant. So buffing a card like the mirror by this much was such a bad move by Clash Royale, since that basically made the game even more unbalanced, and Clash Royale had to revert this change later in the year anyways, so it actually had a long-term negative impact on the game, since this +2 leveled mirror led to a series of terrible metas in the time that it was overpowered.
Probably gonna go E-Giant here. Okay, that was kind of a bad Golden Knight, I think. Ooh, he also just messed up the Tornado. So this is definitely going to be time to go in for another E-Giant. This might be the win now. Oh, and he just played the Inferno Drag right into that, so he really just screwed up. We're gonna go Tornado here, do the dash with the Golden Knight. We don't get it on the King Tower, but this is going to be a really solid push coming in here. We could probably Rocket, because we know, yeah, I knew he was going to go for a Cage. And then guess what? We just mirror the Rocket, and that is going to do it.
There really isn't much else to say about this balance change. It will go down as one of the worst balance changes in Clash Royale history. I talked about the Void in both of my videos of the best and the worst cards of all time, which goes to show you how unbalanced this card has been. And even though its initial set of nerfs were pretty decent, I think Clash Royale just gave up with the card and gave it a nerf so large that there would never be a point of return for this card unless they reverted this change. They nerfed the Void's single target damage by a whopping 32% without any other compensation, which meant that it couldn't even do a fireball's worth of damage even if 2 full strikes landed, which is so sad, since a fireball is guaranteed splash damage, while the Void only deals maximum damage with a single shot. And since the Void depends on the surprise factor to do well, as more and more people adapted to it, it just became easier and easier to deal with. And the sad thing is that after this change, even if you couldn't react to it fast enough, the Void's damage was so bad that it wouldn't even be worth playing it, since you can usually react to it once the first strike hits, which does around the same damage as an arrow's, which is horrendous. This balance change just felt like Clash Royale was giving up on one of its most unique card releases. It would have been so much better if Clash Royale slowly nerfed the Void till it reached a balanced usage rate, rather than going all in and then having to work backwards, which keep in mind isn't even happening, since Clash Royale has completely given up on this card. The Void went from having a 15% usage rate before this nerf, which keep in mind is after a couple of sets of nerfs, to basically 0% overnight after this change. It's hard to describe how bad this balance change was. Rather than trying to fix the card, Clash Royale just killed it so that they wouldn't have to look at it again. But the thing is, Clash Royale has done so much worse. The Vine spell on release was a contender for the top 10 most broken cards of all time, and so it should have been a great balance change if Clash Royale was emergency nerfing it. But I actually think the way that the emergency nerf of the Vine spell was carried out is easily one of the worst balance changes of all time. And as a matter of fact, rather than me focusing on just the Vine spell, I think it actually makes more sense for me to describe emergency nerfs overall as terrible balance changes, since I feel like a lot of emergency nerfs that Clash Royale gives cards are executed so horribly. And yeah, I get it. Clash Royale purposely only gives small emergency nerfs to broken cards, to prevent it from hurting their shop offer sales, as well as portraying themselves to people that they actually care about game balance. But I feel like there has to be a better way to carry out these emergency balance changes. I feel like a lot of people wouldn't even realize that the Vine spell was emergency nerfed, since the nerf they gave it barely affected any interactions. They reduced its damage by 17%, but the thing is, barely any interactions changed. The Vines could still deal as much damage as arrows, and it still had its broken stun ability. The fact that Clash Royale didn't even touch the thing that made the Vines OP was such a terrible change, and it makes sense that the Vine spell maintained a 60% usage rate in competitive play after this change.
A 60% usage rate inside the top 1000? I mean, what are we doing? If you scroll through the top 100, every single deck is running Vines. I mean, I get it, they did one nerf, they tried, but this right here is still just so unreasonable.
It took Clash Royale over a month to properly balance this card out, and it's not just for the Vines. When the Spirit Empress came out, Clash Royale decided to emergency buff it, just because it was a perfectly balanced card on release, which is so insane to think about. And this change basically made the Spirit Empress one of the best cards in the game for a month, until Clash Royale basically reverted the change a month later, which would normally make no sense unless they had a Spirit Empress shop offer for this duration. And when the Monk and Phoenix came out, Clash Royale did the same thing, where they only gave them small emergency nerfs and let them torment the meta for almost 2 months, until they actually gave them proper nerfs. The player base is so desensitized to these terrible balance changes that when the Evo Skami came out, a lot of people actually thought that it was a bad evolution, which I disagree, since I think it's actually pretty strong, but it just goes to show that emergency balance changes both in the form of buffs and nerfs are so unhealthy for Clash Royale. It's clear that Clash Royale wants tower troops to work, but I feel like they're stuck in this cycle, where if they keep tower troops strong, then it means that the Princess Tower won't be the best tower troop, but if tower troops are weak, they need to buff them again and the cycle repeats. However, Clash Royale finally broke out of this cycle in August and September 2025, because they nerfed the Dagger Duchess and Cannoneer once again, despite both of these tower troops already being the worst tower troops in the game, just so that the Princess Tower would become more popular than it already was. The reason I think this balance change is so bad is because it's clear that they are purposely keeping tower troops weak, despite them making such a big deal about them literally a year ago. I just don't understand how nerfing cards that are already dead would make a difference. In April 2025, they nerfed the Dagger Duchess's damage just because she was making a slight comeback during the Hyperbait meta, and even in August 2025, they increased the Dagger Duchess's attack time interval, which meant that she would attack slower, which was so bad for the Dagger Duchess, since the meta wasn't even suitable for her, since the Furnace killed bait. Clash Royale was nerfing a card that was already dead for no reason, despite there being so many cards that they should have been fixing, like the Void and the Prince. And to make things worse, in trying to nerf the Cannoneer, they actually basically buffed it, since they reworked his attack time interval so it was faster, but reduced his total damage. Again, this was so pointless, since they were clearly trying to make the Cannoneer less of a damage dealer, but ended up actually making the Cannoneer better at dealing with Swarm, and in the case of the meta, the Furnace. I genuinely have no clue what was going on during these two balance changes, since I would argue they are both equally terrible. Not only was Clash Royale nerfing a dead tower troop, they also accidentally buffed a tower troop despite trying their best to nerf it, which is so crazy. And I find it so funny that these changes led to not only the Dagger Duchess being basically dead in this meta, but also the Cannoneer became the most used tower troop in the meta, and it had the highest win rate, even higher than the Princess Tower, so it literally had the opposite effect of what they wanted. I feel like this one is more of an honorable mention, but it's something I've always wanted to talk about. I feel like a lot of people wouldn't really count this as a nerf, but some card art changes have genuinely been so terrible. I feel like the 3 biggest nerfs we got to card art profiles has to be the Night Witch, the Knight, and worst of all, the Executioner. Starting off with the Night Witch, I feel like the old art had so much presence and mystery, and it actually looked legendary, and in 2022, they made the Night Witch card art way too goofy, and it just didn't have that Night Night Witch presence, and I guess that kind of mirrors how terrible the Night Witch was in 2022, but I really want them to bring the old Night Witch art back. The second worst card art nerf has to be the Knight when they released the Evo Knight. I feel like the Knight had the perfect card art that wasn't too menacing but also wasn't too goofy, which was a good representation of the card, since in the end, he's just good stats for the cost. He's not too OP, neither is he a weak card. So when they changed his card art to this monstrosity, I can't even begin to describe how sad I was to see such a legendary card icon be removed. I can't really describe it, but it just lacks the emotion that the old one had. But none of this even comes close to how horrible they did the Executioner. The original Executioner card art was so menacing, and it embodied the card really well, but the change they gave the card shortly after he was released was so horrible. It made the Executioner look so goofy, and it ruined what it meant to be an Executioner in Clash Royale. I mean, being an Executioner surely can't be as fun as how he looks in his art, so it's really off-putting. I also think they just got his proportions wrong here with the new one. The old one just looked so much more composed. The Tornado has always been a very good card in Clash Royale, because it caters to top ladder players as well as lower arena players pretty well. However, in April 2025, Clash Royale attempted to nerf the Tornado by decreasing its damage by 50% and reducing the number of damage ticks to 1 instead of 2. This nerf meant that the Tornado could now pull troops without dealing damage until the second tick, and even though I admit that the Tornado was a strong card, a quote-unquote nerf like this can't have been the best way to balance this card out. First of all, the leveling problem is already so bad in Clash Royale, so making Tornado even more level dependent was definitely not the play. After this change, even equal level Tornado could barely kill a skeleton, so it meant that underlevel Tornado couldn't even kill skeletons, which used to be strategic since it allowed King Tower activations from skeletons of a graveyard, but in this case, it made level differences worse, since interactions between cards like the Goblin Gang and skeletons were completely different, and this change wouldn't really affect top ladder gameplay, since in the end, top ladder players mainly would use Tornado to move things around rather than deal damage, although it was still a nice swarm killer. And also, top ladder players aren't often over or under leveled, so the fact that this nerf was targeted at top ladder players but ended up only affecting lower ladder players is also pretty bad. On top of that, the Tornado has never really been problematic by itself. It's a synergy card, not a broken card in isolation. So nerfing a card that is only popular due to its synergies just doesn't make sense, since this nerf was clearly targeted to reduce the dominance of Minor Magic Archer. This Reddit post sums it up pretty well. Once the meta revolves around another card that synergizes well with the Tornado, it will rise to popularity again. You can't just reduce the power of the Tornado, you can only reduce the power of the cards it synergizes with. And this can't be more true than in the current meta. The Tornado is a top 5 spell even in the current meta, sitting at a 17% usage rate in top 200, mainly because of the popularity of bait and minor decks as well as graveyard. Clash Royale could keep nerfing its damage, but in the end, it's still gonna be super popular, mainly because of its ability. But Clash Royale can't nerf its ability, otherwise it would kill the card. Its radius can never change, and its pull strength can't change either, otherwise it messes up so many interactions that Clash Royale may as well leave it as it is. So basically, this nerf did nothing to the Tornado's usage in top ladder, but made the level difference problem so much worse. It's easily one of the worst thought out balance changes in Clash Royale history. I hope you enjoyed this video though. Thanks for watching.